Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Optum Rx webinar, Future Trends and Insights Impacting Drug Spend. My name is Heather, and I'll be your host. At the bottom of your webinar screen are multiple application widgets that you can use to customize your viewing experience of the speakers and slides. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide window. Resources, articles, and links to related topics can be found in the Additional Resources widget. We also have a widget that you can use at any time to fill out a survey during the presentation to give us feedback. You will receive an email with a link to the recording in the next 24 hours. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. And I would now like to introduce Dr. John Wigg, Chief Clinical Officer at Optum Rx.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for joining us today. I'm John Wigg, Chief Clinical Officer at Optum Rx, and I'm joined by Marley Arbuckle, who's our Vice President of Trend Intelligence at Optum Rx. So really happy that you're spending the next 45 minutes. I guess happy nowadays can mean different things, particularly when you're thinking about drug trend. But hopefully today we can give you a good sense of the trends that are impacting us, at least from a high level. Just a little background for those of you who don't know me. I'm was a practicing nephrologist early in my career, and I've had a variety of roles in healthcare, from earlier pharma and med device and traditional medical affairs. And then most recently was Chief Medical Officer at Walmart and at Express Scripts. And so have seen probably every corner of the healthcare ecosystem. And in some ways, things have changed a lot, and in other ways, things haven't. So, but hopefully today is going to be impactful for you guys. So let me just go over a few things as we think about what we're going to do next. We're going to, cover some of the basics, the macro trends, pipeline, gene therapy, thinking about some solution offerings. But it's probably good to just caveat this with where we are today, which, there is, such a degree of awareness on medication and access. And while for many of us who've been in the PBM space, it's always been specialty, and specialty probably will continue. GLPs have, the weight loss medications have really raised the bar as nowadays this is in the public consciousness. And so when you can go on YouTube and find a drug trend report, that means something. It's pretty remarkable. I say this in that while we'll talk about trend, utilization, rebates, it's not just about those factors anymore. And it's also not just about describing trends. So we're trying to think a little bit more about, how to be more proactive. How do you predict trend? How do you think about utilization? And in particular, what makes a patient want to take a medication? When is a medication really influencing the total cost of care? And so how we think about trend and what we do to benefit design is going to be probably even more critical. And then you throw in all the other aspects. If you're watching the news, or if you're not watching the news, you're going to hear about it. Things such as tariffs that, on one hand, may spare the pharmaceutical space or may not. But, this becomes more than an active ingredient in a drug. There's shipping costs, there's excipients, there's supply and demand constraints, there's whether it impacts generics or brands, and generics are likely going to be much more sensitive to that. We're really thinking about things in a way that's even beyond sort of a drug and a novel entrant. And interestingly enough, Eli Lilly's CEO, David Ricks, recently stated this, is that some of these things are going to impact, what you think about in R&D and whether a drug even comes to market in the first place. And that is going to impact trends. So just some things to kind of keep in the back of your mind, and some of the things that we're thinking about as we think about how do we think about trend in a much more holistic way. I think the positives, obviously, is some of the opportunities we have with biosimilars, and then also opportunities to think about rethinking formulary, whether it's low WAC, whether we think about total cost of care and move away from is a drug affordable now to whether it really reduces care. That's ultimately where this is going to have to go. Many of the things that you think about with trend historically are what it is. It's a sticker, but really trying to figure out how we drive that down. And this is total cost of care is really where it's going to make an impact. So just some things to think about. We certainly don't want this to be didactic, but a lot of this is just sort of getting people up to speed on where things are and how we're thinking about things going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marley and take it from here.
Thank you, Dr. Wig. That's a great tee up in many of the items that we're actually going to cover today in a very short amount of time. So I'll get right to it. But first, let me introduce myself. I am a pharmacist by training. I've been a pharmacist for about 27 years. Prior to coming on board with Optum a little over a year ago, I spent time in retail and specialty pharmacy. But the last 16 years specifically, I did spend in the PBM space, particularly focused on specialty drug management, everything from product development to sales and account management support to collaborating with various specialty pharmacy teams. But today I lead our trend intelligence team, and we work very closely with our clinical consultants, our account teams, pipeline, clinical analytics, and product groups. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we'll spend a bit of time on what has happened, kind of looking back to 2024, but more on what could happen in the next 5 years, and hopefully adding for you a little bit more to the why, and then end with a few around trend mitigation amidst a very dynamic landscape that we see ourselves in today. So just to level set, for those of you who may not be as familiar with trend, when we're talking about the basics, simplify it, and our analytics to look specific to answer our questions like, are drugs being used more, and which ones? Are they more expensive? Are they less expensive? How do rebates contribute to the trend? Factoring in things like AMP cap into the pricing. How does other pricing in the trend? Those are all questions that we need to ask, and then look at it, as a trend, period over period. What changed and to what degree did it change? And what this helps us do is answer questions. It helps us to better understand the changes that we're seeing in the data. It helps us to identify root cause. It provides some comparability to the benchmark in more detail than we would have had. And it helps us to pinpoint possible solutions. And just to give you an idea of the complexity of each of these components that you see here, these drivers, they seem pretty basic, but just in utilization alone, as an example, changes like aging population, program tweaks, increased adherence, new products, benefit structure changes, shifts from medical to pharmacy benefit, all of those things can have an impact on utilization. And also, when we think about trend, we're measuring changes over a period of time, right? Whether that's year over year, reporting period over reporting period, and trend is not the same thing as spend. And I have here two ways that we can look at our 2024 year-to-date commercial book of business numbers. This is all inclusive of all commercial lines of business. So you have a conglomerate of, plans that are covering weight loss, GLPs, and plans that don't have certain coverage strategies in place and other stuff. So it's a high level overview of the commercial book of business. And the table that you see on the right shows the top 5 disease states by spend and by trend that are bolded, representing the top 5 for each. So those that are bolded are representing the top 5 by spend in the first column and the top 5 by trend. And there's some commonality that you see there. And just in case you're a visual person like me, the same data is pictorial on the left-hand side with the bar graphs that you see there. So you can see the top 5 categories by spend represent over half of total drug spend. While on the lower bar graph, the top 5 categories by trend drove 71% of total trend. And of course, you see diabetes and weight loss driven by GLPs. You see inflammatory, driven largely by Dupixent, Skyrizi. You see antiviral category 2, that was driven by Paxlovid in 2024. So obviously there are some slight variability, or there is some slight variability when you compare commercial to then other lines of business. So if we can compare commercial to our Medicare and Medicaid lines of business, you're going to see some variations based on coverage policies, demographic variances, coverage policies on weight loss GLPs, for example, in the Medicare space. But there is some commonality among each line of business with inflammatory, oncology, and diabetes. You will see them somewhere in the top 5 by trend and spend across all lines of business. Sometimes your top 5 trend and spend categories, you'll have some commonality, sometimes you won't. There are circumstances where you may not have a ton of utilization, for example, but you will have a very high cost drug that could impact your spend. And the other way around, sometimes you see a lot of spend, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not an impactful trend. But why do we see the same spend and trend in our top 5 or so? Well, it's because the cost of the drugs, the prevalence of the conditions that they're treating, combined with treatment innovations, and the chronic nature of the conditions. All of that combined is contributing to why you're seeing the categories that you're seeing in both trend and spend. But before we go deeper into future trends, I want to highlight what we've seen historically and what we can anticipate in 2025 for new drug approvals. We expect about 3/4 of the approvals to be in the specialty space. Nearly 60% will have orphan drug designations, which is up from last year. And about 1/4 of approvals will be in the oncology space. In fact, about half of drug approvals just since 2015 have actually been in the rare cancer space. And when we're talking about rare disease, orphan drugs, we're talking about conditions like cystic fibrosis and drugs in that are used to treat a condition like cystic fibrosis, like Alytrek and Trikafta. These are drugs that are treating the underlying cause of a very complicated multi-organ genetic disease. And for this disease alone, advances in drug therapy over the decades has meant a difference in life expectancy of that of a kindergartner. Back in the 50s, for someone living with cystic fibrosis, their life expectancy was 5 or 6 years old. And now, fast forward, because of these therapies, we're seeing patients with a life expectancy now in about the mid-40s. So yes, these therapies have a high price point. They're treating a very small population of patients, but these therapy advancements are critical for patients suffering from rare disease. And just as a reminder, when we're thinking about pipeline, globally there's about 7,000 rare diseases identified. The majority of them are genetic. And because they're genetic, about half of those impacted are children. But most of them, like 95%, lack treatment options. So we have just huge growth potential still in the rare disease space. We haven't, tapped into it. It's the tip of the iceberg. And in the United States alone, there are about 30 million Americans, or about 1 in 10 individuals that have a rare disease. All right, before moving on to the future trends in 5 years, I want to touch a little bit on gene therapies. We have the added challenge in our drug landscape of tracking gene therapies, which have by and large been medical benefit treatments. But there are more and more gene therapies coming out. And remember, these treat orphan rare diseases. We're talking about very small patient populations to treat very specific conditions. These are very personalized therapies. And the smaller the treatment population, the higher your R&D, the higher the ultimate price tag. And let's look back. Back in 2019, I think everybody remembers Zolgensma for SMA when it came out. It became officially the most expensive drug when it came out in 2019 at $2.1 million for a course of treatment. But what we're challenged with these therapies is knowing long-term safety. long-term efficacy. Is it really a one and done treatment? Long-term risk associated with the durability of replacement genes, cost compared to non-gene treatments that already exist, and then ultimately prescriber and patient interest. And actually, this is what happened to Becfez for hemophilia B, which just came out last year. Pfizer recently decided to cease global development and commercialization for several reasons, including limited interest in that patient population and provider population. But patients suffering from these horrific genetic diseases, these gene therapies do offer hope. So looking ahead in 2025, what we could potentially see, there is pretty significant cost associated because of our capability to be more prescriptive and have very specific personalized care. But we just need to remember gene therapy, yes, it's exciting, but it's also going to continue offering a lot of challenges. Okay, so now I'm going to spend some time talking about what to expect 5 years from now in 2030, focusing on 4 main categories. And keep in mind, these are all, what I'm about to talk about, they're all global estimates. Geographically, obviously, you can have shifts of disease prevalence, you can have different coverage policies and various economic differences. But starting with oncology, according to Evaluate World Preview 2024, oncology may not dominate the top 10 drugs by overall spend. So oncology drugs themselves may not be in that top 10, but oncology as a category is projected to be the largest category by 2030, surpassing what we call metabolic, so your diabetes and weight loss medications, inflammatory and central nervous system agents all combined. And why is that? The pipeline, right? The pipeline is strong. We have investigational therapies in rare cancer. We're seeing new treatment modalities like antibody drug conjugates and radiopharmaceuticals. And about 25% of the new drug approvals for this year hope to be in oncology as well. But let's talk a minute about Keytruda. Okay, so Keytruda's reformulation to subcutaneous raises some questions about potential shifts between medical and the pharmacy benefit. Its key patent, along with Opdivo's, will expire in 2028. And so we have seen this historically, similar shifts. We've seen shifts in asthma, inflammatory, MS. We've seen drugs shift from medical to RX benefit with reformulations. Keytruda's reformulation still requires administration by a healthcare provider. So to be determined what exactly this means. So, but we're asking these questions. What happens when a pan-cancer drug, approved for 40 indications in the cancer space, suddenly becomes available in the sub-Q formulation? These are, life cycle management strategies from our pharma partners, and they will be crucial for them to maintain their market share. And like I said, Keytruda is not the only one. Opdivo's in the mix. Merck specifically said that they expect Keytruda to be affected by the Inflation Reduction Act in 2026 with price changes in 2028. But remember, as part of manufacturer fair price negotiations, there's one price negotiated for the portfolio of the drug. So for a drug like Keytruda, I wouldn't necessarily anticipate negotiations would be based on older formulations and probably more so new formulations. And Dr. Wig, I saw you go back on camera. I'm curious as to your thoughts here as we look ahead 5 years from now in the oncology space and these projections, and we're still seeing drugs like Keytruda. I mean, Keytruda has been a top prescribed drug over the last few years anyway. Will we continue to see it along with Opdivo despite these reformulations? What's your take on that?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important point. I wanted to just make one comment on that. I think this comes back to what I was talking about before on total cost of care, right? So whether the economics are better, pharmacy or medical, that would have to be looked at. Obviously, the maximum fair price negotiations, that's something also that's going to weigh into this. The way I look at this is it comes back to total cost of care,
Oh, I can hear you now, Dr. To Dr. Wig, maybe at the end. Again, this is looking at 2030 worldwide predictions. Half of the top 10 products, so 5 of the top 10 products in 2030 are expected to be in this metabolic space. So we're talking about diabetes and weight loss. The front runner GLPs that we have seen are only the tip of the iceberg. We have yet to see the plateau here. So according to a study published by the American Journal of Health System Pharmacy, semaglutide as a drug entity was actually the most popular drug entity by overall US spend in 2023. So we don't know what the plateau is, we don't know where it is, and there are so many things to think about as I have listed over there on the right-hand side. We do expect continued innovation, certainly in this space. We expect to see those next generation products, probably more convenient dosing methods, maybe less frequent dosing. But what is going on in this market to keep the expansion going? Medical weight loss programs are of higher interest because the patient demand for long-term solutions is driving this expansion. We're also seeing expanded indications in the GLP space as well as new drugs. So GLPs are gaining expanded indications we've seen in cardiovascular, we've seen in obstructive sleep apnea, kidney disease, we'll see in liver fibrosis. And just for OSA alone, coverage could expand to an additional 1.4% of the US population, potentially, but treatment guidelines also need to be reviewed and updated, right? But Zepbound provides the first pharmacologic treatment option in the space, as other options are your devices or surgery. So to be determined the exact range of impact that this could have, because again, treatment guidelines need to be reviewed and updated. We could see once weekly sub-Q basal insulin. We could see GLP amylin analog combinations for diabetes and obesity. They're also emerging. And then we're also seeing GLP shortage lift, right? So all of this is kind of happening at the same time, but there is a more holistic impact or ripple effect of weight loss management that extends beyond just a single disease when you really think about it. So what I'm talking about is, yes, weight loss therapies have significant impact. They're having benefits. There's been surveys done on patients taking GLP medications. One of them was by PricewaterhouseCoopers International, and they surveyed about 3,000 members. They found about a third of them were reporting, positive outcomes like decreased alcohol consumption, better self-image, cutting down on their food purchases, having more confidence, and increased physical activity. And all of that is positive, but thinking past the treatment as a single disease, what we have found in our data is that those using a weight loss GLP are actually 30% more likely to have 2 or more comorbidities versus population of patients not taking a weight loss GLP. And that's likely, that likelihood actually increases as the number of comorbidities increase. So when we're looking at patients that have 3 or more comorbidities, the GLP population was 60% more likely to have 3 or more comorbidities. So it just keeps going up the more comorbidities that are added on. So this affects, overall cost of care, especially for weight-based specialty medications. When we think past it, we're thinking about all these medications, especially that are very costly, that are weight-based, inflammatory, oncology, just as an example. Dr. Wig, I see you're back on. Okay, I saw a smile, so it got frozen.
Maybe the system didn't like my comment, but what I was maybe tying it back into what I was saying before is whether it's pharmacy, medical, whether it's you're talking about GLPs, we're really thinking about a total cost of care paradigm, right? So, the thing that's really encouraging with GLPs is the fact that particularly for people with those comorbid conditions, CKD, heart failure, obstructive sleep apnea. These are real game changers. But I think we're sort of facing a little bit of the short-term affordability versus sort of the larger data sets that we need to really understand what total cost of care looks like. And so that's sort of a little bit of what's marring the entire ecosystem now, is that, we talk about, it's, this is painful on the pharmacy benefit side or medical benefit side. And if you have that lens, it's sort of, you lose sort of really what ultimately the patient requires. So if it's a sub-Q formulation that makes it easier for a patient and you have better outcomes, we should be really thinking about it from that lens. And I think that's the challenge, Marley, in terms of the system we have right now, is that it's not equipped to think about things with the types of medications that are coming out, the type of thinking we're going to need to do for to really wrestle with value.
100%. I agree. Thank you for that commentary. I want to keep going here and briefly touch on inflammatory. In 2030, no surprise, we still see inflammatory in 5 years, right? But the reason is, I think it's really interesting, and I think we all know this, but maybe it hasn't been called out explicitly. When we look at inflammatory as a category, there's two sub-markets going on. There's two growth markets in here. And IQVIA had a report in 2023 called Changing of the Guard. It's really well written. And it kind of broke them down into these two growth markets that you see in the lower 4% there. Think of Humira, Enbrel, the drugs that are used for your rheumatologic conditions, your psoriasis, your irritable bowel disease. There's still expected growth in this space, 4% CAGR from 2022 to 2027. But the other bucket where Dupixent lies, they called it inflammation, it's projected to grow at 12+%, so 12 to 15% CAGR from 2022 to 2027. And that's pretty significant. And the reason behind that is that it is a relatively immature market when compared to the other market, right? So Dupixent has the market share. We haven't seen products that are showing superiority quite yet, but we're seeing emerging therapies. But these are conditions that are relatively common, like your eczema, your atopic dermatitis, and certain types of asthma. So that's why we're seeing the growth that we're seeing. That's why we're going to continue to see it. And that is why in the worldwide projections, Dupixent is proposed to be number 2 in the top 10 list in 2030. And when you look at the other drugs in this category, I mean, each of them is like a pipeline within a product, right? So even Skyrizi is anticipated to continue to have market share, holding at number 6. It recently had expanded approval in the irritable bowel disease space, I believe, with ulcerative colitis. So you're continuing to see these pipelines within a product. And then we ask ourselves, okay, how is biosimilar adoption going to help offset some of the growth that we're seeing in this space? We've had a lot of challenges in the United States that haven't been experienced in like the EU, for example, especially with the self-injectables. So we need to see increased competition. We need to see patent expirations, and we need to see a bulk of them at one time to really help see a significant offset, because they're just kind of trickling in at the moment. But this is an area of opportunity where we have the potential to negatively impact the trend and spend numbers. Okay, so rounding out the top 10 in 2030 is in the CNS space. And we're talking specifically about Jornavix, Cobenfy, and Kisunla as 8, 9, and 10, according to Evaluate's report. Jornavix is notable because it's the first non-opioid acute pain drug in over 20 years. So it's addressing a need for an alternative amid the opioid crisis. Still, we need to understand it on a long-term basis. There is ongoing evaluations for clinical value and safety as payers determine a coverage strategy around it. Cobenfy, with its new mechanism of action for schizophrenia. So it's expected to actually offer some benefits over the current atypical antipsychotics, and maybe even have areas like Alzheimer's psychosis, Parkinson's agitation that it can be used for. Potentially bringing better side effect profile and maybe improving adherence. So we're watching that medication. And then Kisunla offers hope in, the Alzheimer's community. It's had a bumpy road following Aduhelm's very controversial expedited approval and then ultimate withdrawal. So it's following that, but it's on the market, but really to be determined the exact uptake, but still definitely offering another treatment option for this very difficult to manage condition. Okay, so now I want to pivot just a little bit. Certainly, as Dr. Wig alluded to earlier, there's several external factors that can influence trends over time, raising more questions than answers. And the main concern here is the uncertainty, honestly, the known unknowns, if you will. We're in a different environment right now with new, more indirect drivers of spend and trend. And so, as Dr. Wig had mentioned earlier, while we're keeping an eye on all these different things from a clinical perspective and the drugs that are coming to market, there are also other indirect influencers of trends, things that influence cost and access. And from day to day, the story is changing, right? We're experiencing that now with, the tariff discussions. The current administration has paused for a bit, exempting pharmaceutical industry for now. But as, again, Dr. Wig said, David Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly, he and some other major executives in manufacturing sector are just not as optimistic. And so the questions are being asked, will this encourage manufacturer relocation to the United States? Maybe for some companies, maybe more so for the branded manufacturers. But folks like Mr. Ricks is doubtful that this will create the hundreds of billions in additional revenue that's promised by the current administration. And obviously there are trade-offs. As Dr. Woods said earlier, they have to eat those costs somewhere. And typically that's by way of staff reduction or R&D. And unfortunately, R&D may suffer here. But other folks, Tom Kraus, VP of Government Relations at ASHP, talked about bulk chemicals and the starting materials for drugs not being exempt, which means generics could still be impacted. And that accounts for about 90% of the prescriptions in the United States. So generics potentially cause the biggest concern. Dr. Scott Gottlieb actually had a comment a couple days ago on CNBC. And he said these margins are already low or negative. And so there's concern that manufacturers just may want to, not participate anymore. So there's a lot of questions. We don't have answers. We have a lot of questions. The biopharma industry is preparing for potential disruptions to the global supply chain. And we understand at Optum, just full disclosure, we understand this is a highly fluid situation. Information is changing day by day. And, we've been proactively assessing potential impacts of cost increases to import drugs for the U.S. clients, members, our business. We believe manufacturers will be limited in their ability to increase prices for branded drugs, potentially initially for brands. We do have price protection in place across both government and commercial clients. We anticipate there could be list price increases for generics, and we're working to mitigate the impact for our clients and members. And we understand these tariffs are impacting you directly too, significantly as well. So we're committed to being good partners on identifying solutions to manage cost and minimize the impact for you and your members as well. And aside from tariffs, Dr. Wig, there are all these other, known unknowns that I have listed here. I don't even think I have tariffs on the list because it's such a new thing that has occurred. But we're talking about Medicare price negotiation program. Could Medicare pricing and utilization management strategies be adopted more broadly? How will reformulations of near-term patent drugs influence that price negotiation program? How are biosimilars going to help offset the trends that we're seeing? And you were talking about too, even this year, the expected new drug approvals that we were hoping to see, will recent federal layoffs have any impact on drug submissions, reviews, and approvals? So, given all of these different components that are driving healthcare costs, what do you believe will have the most significant impact on trend management in the next 5 years? And why do you think that?
Yeah, and that's a super difficult question, Marley. I mean, I would say that the at least in the short term, right, the levers that are probably going to be the most impactful are, utilization, formulary management, better benefit design, clinical programs. But the unknowns of what you're mentioning are the things that are really difficult, particularly if regulations are changing or viewpoints are changing week to week. That throws a wrench into things versus new drugs that are coming, which you want from a patient perspective. So I think it's remains to be seen. I think the positive, I think, with all of this is that it is going to force us to think about total cost of care. It's going to be very difficult to approach this just on a siloed basis. I think most on the call recognize this. So being proactive, using data in different ways, really from a client to member by members, perspective, rather than sort of a cookie cutter approach is probably what's going to be required. But more to come. It's definitely a challenging environment, and particularly we really care about what the patient impact is.
Right. Well, that's great insight. I think we've established none of us have the magic 8 ball, right? We there's so much uncertainty, especially in the landscape that we work in. We have to pivot. We have to, learn from real world experiences. We have to pivot. We see it all the time, and the industry is anything but predictable. And I think this is just a small example of this. When I was doing some research, I found the study that IQVIA did. They were tracking 2024 trends in illegal online pharmacy usage during a period of shortage. And it was shortage of GLPs, ADHD, and opioids, as you see there. And you can see the GLPs prevalence is much higher than the others in the use of illegal online pharmacies. And what this causes us to do is just, ask ourselves the basic questions. Can we control a drug shortage? No, we can't. But we can try to prepare. We can learn from it. We can respond meaningfully with the necessary guardrails. But as you said, we have to make sure that it's a thoughtful process, that we always have the patient in mind at the end. This is just an example, in the GLP space. This is why in the GLP space that we've actually implemented additional strategies for that multi-pronged approach. I'm not going to read through this slide. You don't have to read through it, but it's just an example about going beyond your basic block and tackle and providing a nuanced approach at multiple stages of the prescription. Making sure about things like nobody's on a duplicate therapy, right? Making sure that they're not stockpiling, making sure that it's the right type of prescriber. That last edit that you do see there, the provider taxonomy edit, making sure that it's in the scope of practice for that provider to be writing a diabetic GLP. So we're trying to be proactive and predictive as possible. It's clear that we have to be, or otherwise respond as early as possible without sacrificing that patient care and delivery. And I'll just close here and then turn it over to you for any last comments, Dr. Wig. We're just in a very challenging environment right now. We have more questions than answers. And ultimately, it's boiled down to a consultative approach, right? We just have to have multiple angles. We have to think outside of the box. Can't do what we were doing 10 years ago and have to continually pivot. But our goal is to always have the consultative insights and go beyond the traditional methods. Yes, you have the traditional methods, but I think, we just have to keep pivoting, expanding, innovating to make sure that we're being as proactive as possible and patients are being taken care of along the way, and we're not exposing our clients to unnecessary costs too.
Thanks, Marley. Yeah, no, I first of all appreciate everyone joining. Hopefully this was helpful. Any commentary or things that you'd like to see in the future would be very helpful beyond us improving our Wi-Fi. So we'll definitely do that. But thank you very much again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please be sure to fill out the survey to give us your valuable feedback on today's presentation by clicking on the far right widget at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording in the next 24 hours, and there are additional resources available in the widget. We invite you to attend the upcoming OptumRx webinars on May 20th for the regulatory update and May 29th, where we introduce Benefit Central. Thank you so much again for attending today.